In our study of the Kena Upanishad, so far we have seen that there is a lower level of existence of which we are a part, which we know somewhat, and then there is a higher divine existence of which we know practically nothing. And yet, everything in the lower is an inferior representation of something in the higher. Our life is an inferior representation of the divine life energy. Our speech is an inferior representation of the divine power of creation. Our senses are an inferior representation of the divine perception, and so on. And the question is, how are we to rise from this into that? That is always the larger truth, which forms this lower, inferior reality or experience that we have. And yet, there is nothing in our experience which allows us to know that directly. And so the theme of the current study is precisely how are we to make this transition. The second chapter of the Kena Upanishad deals with this in a series of 5 verses which we have read already before. They are cryptic. They are as if playing with a paradox. The first verse says, if you think that you know it well, little do you know the form of the Brahman. So if you think you know, then you don't know. But then how are we to know? And then it tells you how to know. That of it which is you, that of which is in the gods, this you have to think out. And then it says, I think it known. Meaning if you can do that, then you will begin to get a glimpse of it. But then the next verse says, I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. So at that point one begins to sense something which is not yet the thing, and yet you cannot say you don't know it. There is a familiarity developing. He of us who knows it, knows that. He knows that it is not unknown to him. And so we have a certain closeness. And then the third verse. He by whom it is not thought out, has the thought of it. He by whom it is thought out, knows it not. Meaning the means to get to it will be to get beyond your power of thought. And yet the power of thought can take you quite far. But at some point you have to stop using the power of thought, then you get it. As long as you remain there, you don't know it. Then it says, it is unknown to the discernment of those who discern of it. By those who seek not to discern of it, it is discerned. So the moment you're making an effort to know, you cannot know it. But if you do not try to know it, then you can know. It sounds paradoxical, but as we will see, the very next verse tells you how are you to know it by not attempting. Verse 4, when it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. In other words, in this quieting of the receptive consciousness, it reflects. But the reflecting experience comes after. First, there is a process of the awareness that you have of your mind, which brings you up to a certain stage. At that point, the mind has to stop and become quiet and reflect, and then it can receive. By the self one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge one finds immortality. All of this, of course, we will now be, Sri Aurobindo will be leading us to the deeper sense. And finally, verse 5, if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to the knowledge, then great is the perdition. Here meaning, here in this inferior experience of the lower reality, in the mind, in the body, in our senses. We have to get to this realization. Then we have the true knowledge. If you do not get it here, you have lost something very great. You might get it in some higher state and know it only there, but not having it here means you have lost something profound. The wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, and they pass forward from this world and become immortal. That is, in the whole manifestation of this universe, in every object, in every experience, in everything, in all the becomings of that, one is able to see that. And that's when you have the wisdom. And then you have the true immortality. So just in 5 verses, the Upanishad teaches you how to rise from your current human, limited, clouded, darkened consciousness to that higher existence which is the source and our origin. In the commentary, Sri Aurobindo has brought in a further complexity. Because implied in this whole discussion is the idea that you have to know that highest. And yet, we have been talking of knowing this master consciousness, this higher reality. But is that the highest? Is there not something which is the utter Brahman, of which even this is a form? Should we not be getting to that which is utter and not stop with this form, get beyond the cause and the effect? And so in this discussion, Sri Aurobindo shows you that there are in fact 3 levels. There is this domain which is our normal inferior experience of reality. There is this divine reality which is the body and form of Brahman, and then there is the utter, indescribable, ineffable, essential Brahman, the Absolute. And the problem is, even we cannot know this which is the body of Brahman, this higher reality. How are we to even know that? And the real problem for us as human beings is we have to begin with what we are and with what we have, with our intellect, because that is our only means of knowing. And the intellect cannot know that, much less can it know the Absolute. So how are we to begin? And he says in the lines we had read already, yet it is through the principles manifested in the universe that we have to arrive at that. Through the life, through the mind, and through that highest mental knowledge which grasps at the fundamental ideas that are like doors, concealing behind them the Brahman, and yet seeming to reveal him. So what do we have as our means of knowing? Our mind, our life. But these also have an ordinary status, and then in our mind we can rise to something higher and higher, where there is the highest status of mental knowledge where we catch some essential ideas, fundamental ideas that are like doors, concealing and revealing. So it's not yet Brahman that we know, but a gateway, and these are those essential ideas. In practice, for example, you take one of these famous proclamations, all this is verily Brahman. In Sanskrit, Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahman. Or, I am that, so hum. These are called Mahavakyas, great statements. Great is too weak a word. The sense of Maha is vast, including, all-embracing. So Mahavakya, Vakya is speech form. So great articulations which are all-embracing, liberating in their vastness. You could take this, for example, and dwell upon it in your mind. Start with the superficial sense of it. I am that. I'm not that, obviously. But what is it that is in me that is that? And you as if go deeper to your essentiality of who you are. And you find the deeper you go, the closer you come to something essential, which is closely approaching that which is itself the essential of all this. A kind of an introspection where the mind is dwelling upon and rising, ascending step by step in its dwelling. Or all this is verily Brahman. And there again, you begin to look behind the appearances. Obviously, this particular form of the flower is not Brahman. And yet there is something here which is essential, and I begin to dwell upon it. I look at my experiences of the world, my senses, my emotions, my contacts, my interchanges of energy, and I begin to look behind a little deeper and a little deeper, coming closer and closer to some kind of essentiality of perception. And it is being done with the mind, with the life form that you have, but pushing it as if to the limit. So these are the highest mental knowledge which grasp at the fundamental ideas that are like doors. And these doors conceal the Brahman behind them, yet seem to reveal him. It's a passage, but this is as far as the higher part of the mind can go. Is there more? And he will tell us shortly. So if we have difficulty knowing this higher reality of Brahman, the body and form of Brahman, he says we cannot even know the highest. And yet, the truth is that though thus beyond our mentality and our highest ideative knowledge, the Supreme does give himself both to this knowledge and to our mentality in the way proper to each. And by following that way, we can arrive at him. So it's not just that our capacity goes up to a point and then cannot cross, but from the other side, the Supreme gives himself to this highest mentality and to our normal mentality in the way proper to each. If it was not in the way proper to each, we could never use. And so in the way proper to each, he gives himself, that is from him, something is reaching out to you in the very part and capacity that you have to know him, and gives you as if the touch, the tip of the finger briefly touching. And if you can catch that, because he gives it to you in the way your mind can know, if you can catch that, then through that, bit by bit, not only you can open and pass through those doors, but he, remember, is reaching out to you. He then latches on to you and draws you through those doors and into the higher possibilities of perception of him. And by following that way, we can arrive at him. But, Sri Aurobindo says, only on condition that we do not take our mentalizing by the mind and our knowing by the higher thought for the full knowledge and rest in that with a satisfied possession. The condition is we should not stop on these two levels. We should go further beyond. In order to be able to go further beyond, obviously, the mind has to let go at some point. This higher faculty of knowledge within us, the higher knowing, that also has to pause at some point. And yet to get to that point, the higher faculty has to function. To get to that point, our normal thinking has to begin. But we will not stop with either of these. The error of the thinker, philosopher, debater is to stop with the ideas. The ordinary debater stops with the mental arguments and mental ideas. A more profound thinker and philosopher goes into this realm of the higher thought, and there touches something, experiences some insight, and says, oh, I know, and can stop there. And then we lose the opportunity to go to the thing itself. How are we to do that? And this text now, which we are reading, we had briefly read last time, but now we must go deep into it. Sri Aurobindo writes, the way is to use our mind rightly for such knowledge as is open to its highest purified capacity. So there are two things here. There is a higher capacity of the mind as it gets more and more purified, it gets a higher capacity, and there is a highest purified capacity of the mind. And then second thing is to use this capacity rightly. So first you must develop the capacity, and second you must use rightly. Practically, what does that mean? When you look at the deeper practices and values associated with the Indian tradition when in dealing with knowledge, they focused on these two things as the first foundation in education. Informational content was secondary. First foundation was purifying the mind's capacity and the right use of the mind's capacity to be inculcated from childhood as early as possible, in every possible way, as thoroughly as possible. What does it mean in practice? And now I'm going to get to very specific forms. We must recognize while appreciating these forms that the forms are not important. It's the principle behind the forms that we have to grasp. So one of the first things they did for the purifying of the capacity of the mind was remove all influences which are dulling and darkening, which bring inertia, which bring tamas. The most obvious is food. You eat food that dulls your mind, well, your mind will get dull. You eat food which brightens your mind, well, it makes a big difference. Your body being your foundation for the mind's operations. And so there was this emphasis on sattvic food, not tamasic. The other side of this, which is the right use, was also through the food seen in this way. If you eat food which excites your mind, agitates it, makes it go wayward, zigzag, you cannot use it rightly. In order to be able to use it rightly, directly, aiming truly, it cannot be agitated. And so you remove the exciting component of the rajasic food. And the whole focus then is on the sattvicness. Food was one starting point. But the same principle now you can apply in everything else. Activities of the mind. Activities which agitate. Activities which dull. So you wake up from sleep. If you wake up from sleep after the sun has got up, your mind is not exactly in the best condition. If you go to sleep late at night, your mind is dulled, your sleep is dulled, you wake up dull. Tamas. If at night you are in agitation, you go for a party, and in a state of excitement you try to fall asleep, your sleep is excited, disturbed, you wake up disturbed with your nerves frazzled. Your mind is shaken, unsteady, unstable. And so, get your rhythm of sleep. Sleep early, wake up early. Catch the natural rhythm of the energy in the cosmos, around the earth, in the relationship with the sun. And then you have deep, sound, steady sleep, you wake up fresh, and your mind is clear and bright. And it's a fact of experience for all those who have attempted it. If you sleep early and wake up early, the brightest state of your mind is in those early hours of the day. Now these are very objective, tangible, physical practices which helped to purify the capacity of the mind and give it the right turn. The rest would have to do with getting into each of the faculties in the mind and the overall moral purification of the nature and so on. Where the habit to speak a lie, for example, the habit to think in ways which are twisted in order to deceive, that habit itself has to be removed at the roots. Because as children, for example, if you have learnt that by speaking the truth you get into trouble, You avoid trouble by telling a white lie, perhaps. And then the white lie becomes more and more a habit of the mind to the extent that you begin to deceive yourself. Because you have to convince yourself that what you said is true. And a point can come, which is very common in most modern educated children, where they're so used to deceiving themselves that even their thoughts and their emotions are not true and honest of what they feel actually or they think actually. This one can see in the eyes of people. You see a highly sophisticated, educated person in the conventional way, where they have learned to deceive and acquired the skill of deception. In their eyes, you cannot see what they think or what they feel. You take instead a person who has not gone through that training. You look in their eyes and you know what they're thinking, you know what they're feeling. That honesty and transparency in the gaze is a sign of one who has gone through the right kind of training or has not had the training of distortion. In the modern value system, especially with a strong influence of the values that came from the modern transactional mentality developed in the last 100 years in the West, this is highly prized. The skill to be able to deceive, the skill to be able to hide, that people do not know what you actually think, that you can put forward an impression that deceives people so well that you can make them do what you want. This is very highly prized. But when you think about it deeply, it is a perversion of the highest grade. And the future of humanity will be led by those who are able to be transparent, or who are transparent and are able to communicate directly what they know and think deeply, which others can see through and know. Because increasingly, in the vocabulary Sri Aurobindo uses, we are making a transition into a subjective age. The modern age led by reason, rationality and its high power of self-deception and deceiving others, that has passed, it's dead. Modernism has failed. But what is called the postmodern age is one of the subjective perception. What do I feel? My logic has failed me. What do I know to be true? What do I feel to be true? And increasingly, humanity is turning to a kind of a trusting your deeper sensitivity, instinct or intuition. When you see a huge shift today in the political sphere everywhere in the world, all the polls are failing. In all the countries you will see where polls are being done predicting who will be voted by the masses, the polls go so radically wrong that even some of the most advanced, some of the mainstream media are refusing to use polls because they become so unreliable. Why is that? Because the polls catch only some superficial appearance. They are even distorted in order to try to influence people. But the common man has become sufficiently conscious that he is able to sense through those appearances and select someone they trust, even if the person does not seem to be experienced or competent in the conventional way. They want to trust somebody. This shift has happened very suddenly in the last 5 years, and it's happening everywhere in the world. But increasingly, this will be the type for the future where we will sense somebody and feel deeply and see if we can trust them, because we can know this is what they actually think and feel. And there will be a huge shift that will take place. The nature of business will change. The nature of education also will undergo a radical shift as a result of these changes. But this is to point out only that ultimately the great celebration of the power to deceive that was there earlier has to pass, because it is untrue, it is a deception. To have children grow up with this mind trained not to hide, not to deceive, but to see straight and express with clarity and purity and directness. This is extremely valuable to be treasured. So, the way is to use our mind rightly for such knowledge as is open to its highest purified capacity. And so then comes the question of how high can we take this purification? You can start with food and sleep, but that can only go so far. Eventually, there has to be a refinement that takes place in the very way the mind trains itself. And one of the means which they used with great effect was by teaching children to dwell on the ideals. So all the stories we taught little children were idealistic. The stories from the Mahabharata, the stories from the Puranas, they always aimed at a great high truth and imprinted the quest for that, the yearning for that, the value and treasuring of those early on. Contrast this with children who are brought up in the most mundane and superficial values today, where it is, are you wearing this brand of dress? Do you have enough money? What are you going to do when you grow up? Will you be a famous person or not? And these kinds of short-term sensory satisfaction, gratification of the ego and momentary desire was shunned. Instead, you were taught, aim always for the long term. Give up the short-term pleasure, preyas, for the long-term value, the shreyas, that which is higher, superior, finer. And if this is done early on, the whole orientation of the being is towards purification and heightening. You begin to think differently. You begin to think in terms of long-term values. Just as an example, somebody made this statement, some famous quotation. Somebody says that we have not inherited from our ancestors what we have today as the earth. We are borrowing from our children and their grandchildren. You see, the perspective changes radically. We can say all that we have today we have inherited from our ancestors. So we can do what we want because they gave it to us or whatever it is. Or we can turn the same thing around and say, no, we have borrowed from the future generations. And when we give it back to them, we must give it back in the best way possible. You see how the orientation changes. The same position that we are in, you can look at this way or that way. In one perspective, you make it I as your center and project forward the value of your personal short-term satisfaction of desire. And in the other perspective, you put the others first. And you look at the highest, deeper, long-term value. Even in the first perspective as inheritance, you could look at it differently. Instead of looking at it as something we have gained in order to squander, to satisfy our desire, we can say, our ancestors made so much effort to build, to raise, to give us the best. Are we making the best use of it? And immediately the thinking shifts and the values you apply change. Now all of this really goes down to a kind of a very deep culturing which has to be there in the mind. And the culturing is done precisely by dwelling on the higher and higher. And by seeing everything, by thinking everything from the perspective of the higher. And so the mind is refined, the mind is purified, and the most purifying kind of thought is to dwell on the essential. I'm still avoiding the key word, to dwell on the divine. Because at that point immediately one gives to it a certain religious coloring. To dwell on the essential is to dwell on the infinite, on the eternal, on what is true behind the form, on the essence behind the form. And the more one turns in that direction, the more the mind is raised, heightened. And by seeing and engaging with everything in life, all our thoughts, all our emotions, all our actions, from these references, the whole of our being is purified. The heart may participate in this dwelling, It is thus purified by the bhakti, by the devotion, by the love, by the consecration in your work, in your speech, in your actions, to that which is for you the higher, the truer. The three things which are the nourishment for the psychic being's evolution, three words in which the divine represents itself in our material life: Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. The truth, the sacred, the beautiful. And immediately you can see it is not a relative superficial truth we are speaking of, but something deeper. When we speak of Shivam, the auspicious, the sacred, it is not a superficiality, but something deeply felt. And the beautiful is not a superficial beauty, but a deep sense of beauty. These are the things which are the nourishment for the soul. By the dwelling of our entire being on these things, from the beginning, from our childhood into our adulthood, the whole being is thus formed and oriented, ready for the spiritual possibilities and their highest spiritual possibilities. It was with this intent that the mother began the school in the ashram, where children had come as untainted by the conventional educational and societal values, and she sought to cultivate in them these higher values. But this, even if we have not had from our childhood, we can still begin from where we are. Although there is an element of unlearning, undoing because of the past habits, that which is true can override that which is a distortion quickly, if our effort is sincere and all-inclusive. And so the way we have described it, there's already an all-inclusiveness, because in our thoughts, in our emotions, in our actions, and in our deepest sense of value of the soul's triple seeking, we align ourselves to this. And there is quickly a purification and a heightening of the consciousness generally. Here the focus is much more in the mind, but the mind being embedded in all these parts, unless there is an overall purification equally, the mind cannot reach to its highest potential. So, the way is to use our mind rightly for such knowledge as is open to its highest purified capacity. Now, we don't have to reach the highest purified capacity. Once we have begun, already the way begins to open to us. So next, we have to know the form of the Brahman, the master consciousness of the Lord, through and yet beyond the universe in which we live. Now we turn this refined awareness and capacity to knowing the form of the Brahman, this master consciousness, this divinity that we have so far been speaking of, and this mind of our mind, sense of our sense, speech of our speech, life of our life, which is the divine whom we love and adore with all our being. And that is form of the Brahman. How are we to know it? Well, through the universe, through what we are and what we can know and see and feel and engage with of the universe. So we have to go through the universe and yet not stop there, beyond the universe. So through to beyond is the key word here. How does that work? You look at the flower. You can stop the appearance and the practical utility of the flower. I can leave it in the tree. I can pluck it to decorate something, decorate my hair, offer it somewhere, put it in a vase to make the room look beautiful, bring it in a space so that the perfume can spread and change the atmosphere, extract from it the perfume which I can sell. All these possibilities are there. But when I look at the flower, I can look behind to what is deeper. What the flower actually is, it's a conscious being. It is conscious of me, as I can be conscious of it. And the moment I shift to the flower as a conscious being, I'm no more looking at these utilities. To look at utilities would be as perverse perhaps as saying, look at that child who is your brother. What use can you make of him? Shall we train him to be a good servant? Shall we train him to be a good leader? Shall we? And this is how the mentality of the modern age is. And it is represented in the vocabulary when you will see in the government, they have a department called Human Resource, Ministry of Human Resource or Department of Human Resource, meaning human beings are resources to be used. Shape them, use them, exploit them for what? For some other goal. Mostly today the age being of money, it's to boost your GDP, boost your economic value, boost your growth rates by using human beings. And of course this whole perspective dehumanizes not only society but the individual. The moment you see the individual as a conscious soul in evolution, having come here for a purpose, you cannot speak of resources. Your goal will be, how can we serve those human beings to help them grow to their highest possibilities? And it will be no more Ministry of Human Resources, it will be of Ministry of Human Service or Human Support to Evolution or whatever name one chooses to give. So you look at the flower like this, you're not thinking of its utility, you're looking at this person. What use will you make has no meaning. How can this be fulfilled? How can the aspiration and the joy and beauty of the flower be best expressed, intensified, served in the overall awakening in the universe, in the divine? And so the whole thing takes a different form. You may still end up making a garland that you offer or arranging the flowers to beautify a space or leaving it on the tree. But the whole orientation of the relationship and the perception is completely different. And so you've already, in the act of looking beyond the form, you have shifted your level from the superficial to your deeper. Your deeper part is relating to the deeper part of the flower. The nature of the relationship and perspective has all shifted to a depth. And then something happens. What happens in the form may be similar, but in the spirit is fundamentally different. So, we have to know the form of the Brahman, the master consciousness of the Lord, through the universe in which we live, and yet beyond the universe in which we live. So, starting point is this, all this experience that we have. Everything you do in the day, from the time you get up to the time you go to sleep, and even during the sleep, it's all your starting point. But now through all those activities, through these thoughts, feelings, actions, and aspirations, we look beyond to the master consciousness of the Lord. This we have to know through all these things. But first, how are we to do that? But first, we must put aside what is mere form and phenomenon in the universe. So when I looked at the flower, I could focus on the form. Oh yes, this is such and such a flower. I can focus on the phenomenon of the flower. It grows on such and such a tree. It has these medicinal qualities. It has these utilities. All of that is part of the phenomenon. So first we must put aside what is mere form and phenomenon in the universe. And the word mere is essential here. We are not just throwing aside form and phenomenon. We are throwing aside the exclusive focus on form and phenomenon. Now when I look at the flower, I look at what is behind the form and phenomenon, which includes form and phenomenon. And when Mother looked at the flower, she called this flower plasticity. There is a particular quality of consciousness which is innate to this flower, which we can represent by the keyword or the idea of plasticity. That particular vibration, as it expresses itself, takes on this form. And in the phenomenon has this particular outcome, has this particular result and relationship. So, we are looking at the form and phenomenon also, but not merely form and phenomenon. So, but first we must put aside what is mere form and phenomenon in the universe. For that has nothing to do with the form of the Brahman, the body of the self, since it is not his form but only his most external mask. This petal structure, coloring, and whatever other things which we saw as mere form and phenomenon is the most external mask. Now extend this exercise to the whole universe. Everything you look at first, in the way you're habituated to see. This is this object, that is that object, this has this use, that has no use, is the most superficial mask of the body of the divine, his most external mask. And behind that mask, you have to start looking. And as we did with the flower, we immediately begin to sense, this is conscious, it's alive, and I relate to it from my deeper consciousness and life. Sri Aurobindo continues, our first step, therefore, must be to get behind the forms of matter, the forms of life, the forms of mind, and go behind to that which is essential, most real, nearest to actual entity. So now this process goes even further than what we have done. First step is to get behind the forms of matter. We did that already. We didn't stop with the appearance of the flower. We felt behind it the life force, that it was living, that it was conscious. But now we have to get to behind the form of life. What is that? The life force here takes on this particular form as something emerging out of plant and as flower. And we have to as if feel the life energy behind the form of it. And then behind that, behind the forms of mind, it's aware, it is an awareness, but you try to feel the essential part of that awareness, not this particular form in which it sees you. You will find this happening as you stand in the garden, you look at the flowers. Suddenly one flower is as if more conscious and it draws your attention. Oh, this flower is as if speaking to me. The other flowers are not so distinctly conscious or communicating with me. Or this plant, or this tree. Oh, this is more conscious and I feel the connection here. At that point, you are still in the form of the mind, form of the awareness. Get even beyond that and feel the essentiality. This is conscious presence. You don't have to give it a name, but just feel that. Go back to that which is essential, most real, nearest to actual entity. What do you mean by actual entity? Let's say this flower, I could tear off the petals, 2 or 3 of them. Would it still be the same flower? Yes. I could tear off all petals. Would it still be the same flower? Well, not the same form of flower, but it will still be the same thing that it was, the same flower. I can cut off bit by bit. How far would you take out? There's a very interesting experiment done with what is known as Kirlian photography, which under high voltage, the photography allows you to record visually, photograph, the aura of an object. So in one of the experiments, they take a leaf. When you take a photograph with a Kirlian photography, you see around the leaf the glowing aura of the subtle body form. Then you cut the leaf and take a photo. You can distinctly see on the photo that the leaf is cut, but the aura and the subtle body is intact. At least for a while. Over a few minutes or hours, it begins to weaken and fade out. So you can say, even if I cut out entirely all the pieces of the flower, what remains still is the same flower. If you feel now the life energy, if you take out the form of the life energy, the flower is facing this way, the energy flows out and glows out in this way. Forget the form. You feel the pure life force, feel the pure awareness. And at that point, you've come to the most essential part, nearest to actual entity. This is the pure truth of this flower. This is what the mother did when she went deep into the flower. She went into its psychic essence. And there she named it by that quality which it most completely expressed. At this point, we can see how this principle can be applied to everything. Can be applied to other people. You meet somebody, you can straight away say, oh, this is the fellow who abused me last year. I hate him. Or you can peel off those layers. What is it behind? A living being. Behind that, this mind and this extraordinary capacity, including the capacity to pervert, but still, extraordinary capacity. Behind that and deeper, conscious living soul and being in evolution. And you see that, you feel that, you know that, and you relate to that. In the process, you yourself have disengaged from your surface responses and gone to your deeper responses. To deeper sources of relating. And as if something from within you, as deep as you are able to feel, closest to your conscious inner being, from there you relate to the other's inner being. And suddenly all these forms, although they are still there, they are not your priority. And this fellow who had abused me last year, his act of abuse is seen almost incidental. Here is a living being who resonates with the truth, which is essential. And I could relate to that, and all of these things fade out. There's so much that can be done together. And all of us together can do so much on this level. This becomes now the essential, most real, nearest to actual entity. Now you notice, you can do this with people, with objects, with the whole universe. What is this universe? Oh yes, all these forms, the sky, the ocean, the mountains, the trees, the people, these are the superficial forms. And you go behind until you begin to glimpse as if the whole universe is one gigantic conscious divine being. But you go beyond the form of life, the form of mind, and then there is this essential divinity which is pouring out through all this. And you relate to that. And finally, you can do this with yourself. My body form, my life energies, my likes and dislikes, desires, my thought patterns and character, all of these you peel off, and there is only this conscious living awareness. And to the extent that you can feel, to the essentiality as close as you can go to, immortal. Not bound to this life, not bound to this personality. Having passed through many, whose memory I may not have, but I know it is there. It is immortal. So at this point, when one thus begins to peel off and go deeper, and this is the first step, he says, what do we see? What remains? So rereading this text, our first step therefore must be to get behind the forms of matter, the forms of life, the forms of mind, and go back to that which is essential, most real, nearest to actual entity. The things which do not seem but simply are. They are true, real, self-existent. And when we have gone on thus eliminating, thus analyzing all forms into the fundamental entities of the cosmos, we shall find that these fundamental entities are really only two: ourselves and the gods. Now suddenly he says the gods, it's a surprise. And so we have to understand what we mean by gods, and he explains that in the next paragraph. But for the moment, for the conclusion of our discussion, we'll just look at what that represents here in the case of this flower. The flower as a conscious being is almost of the character of a divine being. Because self-existent, immortal even. In the forms of the flowers and the experiences that we had of those forms, the color, the shape, the quality that it expresses even in the phenomenon, you will find as if something of that quality reflected and sustaining all those forms and phenomena. Because this essence of flower is that psychic quality of plasticity, therefore the form takes this way, therefore the phenomena are this, etc. But therefore within the form, within the phenomena, that quality is everywhere. And we will discover that this essential quality or power of consciousness is not just in this form in its center, but in everywhere in the form as it spreads out. Not only in the flower, not only in its petals, not only its color, not only in its shape, not only its interactions energetically with other things, but thus it is felt everywhere in the universe. And as if these essential qualities or powers of consciousness come forward in combinations, making for this appearance of the forms and phenomena of the universe. These essential powers or qualities are universal, and they are conscious. They are living awarenesses, and they are each of them an aspect or a power of the master consciousness behind the Brahman. And so they become as if intermediaries with that. So in the text of the Kena, we are now ready to fully appreciate the first verse of the second part. If you think that you know it well, little indeed do you know the form of Brahman, that of it which is you, that of it which is in the gods. This you have to think out. So when you begin to be conscious of that part of the Brahman which is you, that part of the Brahman which is in the gods, and therefore meaning in everything, in every form, in every phenomenon, when you think of this, then you begin to glimpse that which is behind. I think it known. And so first you begin to have the glimpse, now I'm closer, now I feel, now I can know, now it is as if I'm beginning to know. And so this is the first verse, which now we are able to better appreciate. In the rest of the text, Sri Aurobindo now elaborates what exactly these gods are and the full scope and understanding of this. But in our own way, in our own introspection and exploration, we have come to this, following Sri Aurobindo's guidance, we have come to the perception that there is something which is essential, which is like a conscious power, presence, quality, without which this flower could not express itself as flower. In the next paragraph, when Sri Aurobindo elaborates on the meaning of the gods, he says, and we'll look at it in greater detail next time, but just to complete the discussion, the gods of the Upanishads have been supposed to be a figure for the senses, but although they act in the senses, they are yet much more than that. They represent the divine power in its great and fundamental cosmic functionings, whether in man or in mind and life and matter in general. They are not the functionings themselves, but something of the divine which is essential to their operation and its immediate possessor and cause. They are, as we see from other Upanishads, positive self-representations of the Brahman leading to good, joy, light, love, immortality. As against all that is a dark negation of these things. In one of the thoughts and aphorisms of Sri Aurobindo, you will see the list of all the Vedic deities with their particular characteristic. And I read that. This is number 56 from Thoughts and Aphorisms. And they are all the Sanskrit names of the Vedic deities, but you will see what they represent. Be wide in me, O Varuna, so wideness. Be mighty in me, O Indra. O sun, be very bright and luminous. O moon, be full of charm and sweetness. Be fierce and terrible, O Rudra. Be impetuous and swift, O Maruts. Be strong and bold, O Aryama. Be voluptuous and pleasurable, O Bhaga. Be tender and kind and loving and passionate, O Mitra. Be bright and revealing, O dawn. O night, be solemn and pregnant. O life, be full, ready and buoyant. O death, lead my steps from mansion to mansion. Harmonize all these, O Brahmanaspati. Let me not be subject to these gods, O Kali. So in the whole process, you have actually the entire yoga mapped out with the help of these cosmic deities. And not only each of them has to be developed, they all have to be harmonized, and yet one has to transcend them to that of which they are a representation and go beyond into the consciousness in which all these merge into a single one divine being. And so there's a liberation even from this status. And this idea you will find embodied in the discussion here in the Kena Upanishad. While we are looking at that of the divine which is represented in us, that of the divine which is represented in the gods, but after that we use them as gateways, as entry points to get to the thing itself, the divine consciousness. And so through this process of introspection within us and of things around us, through the appearances of the universe and our life as we are living in it, we enter step by step into something deeper, more true, more real, more essential, until that overwhelms this surface appearance. At this point, we have not abandoned life. We have not abandoned the experiences of life and the forms. We have just engaged with the things behind, the deeper truth behind those forms. I'm still doing my work. I'm still plucking, cutting the flowers, weaving them into a garland, placing them in whatever it is which I was doing. But the whole engagement is different in my internal consciousness and with the thing with which I'm engaging. And the whole interaction therefore shifts into the consciousness of immortality, or towards the consciousness of immortality. And this is the way that is being shown to us, of which we have taken our first step. So we will reread this last paragraph, because now we can get the full, deeper sense of it. The way is to use our mind rightly for such knowledge as is open to its highest purified capacity. We have to know the form of the Brahman, the master consciousness of the Lord, through and yet beyond the universe in which we live. But first, we must put aside what is mere form and phenomenon in the universe. For that has nothing to do with the form of the Brahman, the body of the self, since it is not his form, but only his most external mask. So just behind this most external mask is the body of the self, the form of the self. And it is beautiful, wonderful. Our first step, therefore, must be to get behind the forms of matter, forms of life, the forms of mind, and go back to that which is essential, most real, nearest to actual entity. So all these terms he is using are relative, most real, nearest to actual entity. So it doesn't matter if we cannot go all the way in. We keep going deeper and deeper. And when we have gone on thus eliminating, thus analyzing all forms into the fundamental entities of the cosmos, we shall find that these fundamental entities are really only two: ourselves and the gods. So next Sunday we will look at this a little more deeply, what those fundamental entities are, with examples of how they function and operate, and in what way they're seen as gods. And then how this is meant to be the entry point through which we can engage with and grow in familiarity with that which is beyond. We can meditate on this theme, and even if we like, in the coming days, through the week, make conscious effort to thus go behind the forms analyzing them or eliminating their appearance to that which is more essential, as deep as is natural and comfortable, and engage with all things, all beings, all experiences and relationships at a deeper level and a still deeper level every day.